Okay, I think I'm going to get started. My name is Liz Harley. I'm a Managing Director at Ipsos in Australia and New Zealand. Welcome everybody to the first of a series of webinars that Ipsos will be running with our What is the Future branding, looking at different aspects of the current crisis, what might change because of this, and then down the track other things that we think our clients and friends will find interesting. I'd also like to extend a warm welcome to the AANA members who have joined us today. Ipsos is a strategic partner with the AANA, so it's great from time to time to share with you our foundation type research. And we also have clients from the Hallway Agency with us today, so we hope you find it informative and useful. For today's session, which we have called How Will Society and Business Change?, I will be presenting an overview of the Ipsos Global Trend Study, looking at the global macro forces, the global values and trends, the big picture. Well, my colleague, Dave Elliott from Ipsos Public Affairs, welcome Dave, will focus more on the impact COVID-19 has recently had on Australia and New Zealand and the change we might expect as a result of this. We'll then bring in Jules Hall, CEO at the Hallway. Welcome, Jules.
Morning.
Who will share his perspective on what this means, what this research means for brands and markets on the road to recovery. We are going to record this session, and we can email you a recording of it afterwards, as well as a link to the presentation. The idea this morning is to try and get through this in about 45 minutes or so, maybe some time for questions at the end. Please use the chat tab on the webinar page if you want to post a question, or if you want to email me directly with any questions, you can email liz.harley@ipsos.com or use our branded email, which is WITF, stands for What is the Future, @ipsos.com. And we'll get back to you within a couple of days with the answers if we don't have time to cover everything at the end. To start with, the first thing is today, I'm going to be making some predictions about the future. And it's worth remembering before I do that of course, most predictions are usually wrong. Take this graph, for example, which shows economists trying to make predictions of American 10-year Treasury rates. The blue line is going down and down and shows what actually happened, while the colored lines show their predictions between 1996 and 2015, each few years. And as you can see, they're broadly consistently wrong. The public as a whole are generally wrong. When we asked people last year, just a few months before the virus took off in China, we asked people what they thought the biggest threats to their health were. And you can see this data is from the Global Trend Survey that we're talking about today. We had most people very worried about cancer, things like pollution, but very few people worried about infectious diseases like COVID-19, flu or malaria. So most predictions are wrong. On the other hand, and this is a bit controversial, most opinion pollsters are right, but we usually have to wait to a few days before a general election to give you a very detailed prediction about what's going to happen. Most of the time, people are wrong. So when we talk about what's going to happen, we of course have to admit that nobody knows what will really happen in the future. But there are signs that we can pick on that we think can give us some good indicators. The first of these signs is what we're doing with this global trend study. We asked 370 questions of over 22,000 people around the world. And I'm sure you'll be pleased to know that in the next half hour or so, I'm not going to try and cover up all of those questions. The study covers 33 countries. You can compare China with Australia, Australia with France or Britain, or Mexico with Peru if you want to. One of the key takeaways from the Global Trend Study and today's presentation is that despite the craziness of the times we live in, people saying change is the new normal, the only thing that's constant is change, there's these things called macro forces at play that do not change on a whim. And we need to acknowledge that if we are looking at the future, we need to think about the macro forces that face us, because these are the known knowns. We have identified 6 macro forces from the Global Trend Study. We know that demography is destiny. We know that Europe, with or without COVID-19, is on course to be one of the oldest regions in the world. We know there will be no more Italians in about 170 years if they don't start to raise their birth rate. We know there will be more Nigerians than Americans in fairly short order. So population is one of the no-nos. Also, of course, another macro force is growing inequality and opportunity. And COVID-19, I think, will fall most heavily on particular communities. Much of the upheavals in our politics in the West and Australia has been caused by growing inequality and also reactions to that. And we don't see any change happening there. Geopolitical tensions. We have moved from the world of the late 20th century, built around the Washington Consensus, things like NATO and the International Monetary Fund, and multilateralism. And we go into COVID-19 and the recovery period with China versus America, China versus Australia, the US versus everybody else and within themselves, with Europe versus Russia, and a world that is much more like the mid-Victorian period in some ways than perhaps the world many of us have grown up with. I don't need to talk to all of you about data, but there is more of it than ever, of course. And how that plays out, we'll see. But it has huge implications in terms of how we deal with COVID-19, but also the impact on our societies as a whole. And then I think there's one thing that we should all look out for, which is technology tipping points. And we single this out because this is where one technology combines with another or several technologies to create something entirely new. So for example, to create the Uber taxi service, you need to invent satellites and have GPS. You need to invent the internet. You need to invent the smartphone. You need to do some really clever stuff with radio and miniaturization. You put all these things together and suddenly you have a massively disruptive service that couldn't have existed without any one of those things. So how this all plays out, of course, is something to keep looking for. And then finally, the planet we actually inhabit. Even before COVID-19, we had, of course, more concern about climate change than ever, which I want to come to later. We had bushfires and drought in Australia, flooding all over Europe. And of course, COVID-19 itself is often said to be a warning sign of pandemics that may become a more routine thing. If you listen to Bill Gates back in 2015, he said it was the one thing that we weren't prepared for. And of course, it's likely, according to many experts, that viruses like COVID-19 might become more common as our ecosystems come under more and more pressure, because simply we are interacting with animals more and destroying their environments. So either way, and global warming can possibly make the spread of these diseases even faster, we know these are the known knowns, and it puts human opinions in context of these macro forces. Now, our theory of change does include COVID-19, because we know that there are macro forces that act on human society and create the trends that we often measure in our research. Then there are signals that we can see all around us, which are changing very rapidly at the moment. To give you an example of how this might work, you can see a macro force like climate change leading to a lot more people becoming interested in plant-based diets, thinking about the methane emitted by livestock and the cost to the environment of raising animals. And then, of course, we have signals, which in Australia would be Woolworths, Coles, and even Hungry Jack's, offering consumers significantly more vegan plant-based meal and menu options. And so that's our theory of how these things interact with each other. COVID-19, of course, is a massive shock to that ecosystem, and it's playing out all across it. What we don't know yet is what changes and what doesn't change. We can see an absolute tsunami of signals. You can see people changing shopping hours for older and more vulnerable people. People are doing the shopping for their elderly neighbors. Will they keep doing that afterwards? We don't know, but let's think about it. There's new ways to greet people. You have balcony bingo in Spain. We've had Anzac Day ceremonies at the end of people's driveways here in Australia. We have more exercise classes and communities sharing online. Then you've got escapism for everyone in lockdown. Massive growth of gaming in China and Europe. At the beginning of the lockdown, Xbox crashed online because the demand was so high. We have all sorts of new confrontations. The idea that COVID-19, the idea that COVID-19 was a Chinese invention, that it was brought out in a lab, and indeed 25% of the Australian population believed that it was created in a laboratory. Attacks on people like baby boomers, saying, by Gen Z, saying, that baby boomers are almost causing the problems that are happening due to COVID-19. And then we have the fragile earth, bad science. So we have people who are, full of conspiracy theories and saying that 5G is causing COVID-19. It's certainly not true, but there is an audience for that kind of thing. The link between macro forces and signals, though, is the set of values that shape our society. In the Global Trends Survey, we mapped 170 different questions into about 36 different values. Remembering what we can do is use these values to look at where we might see change starting to happen and express these changes as trends or signals. So let's have a quick look at these values and trends. What's interesting is this factor analysis. It groups these attributes together. So you can see, for example, if we look down here, you've got a group of values more often associated perhaps with some of the economic disenfranchised, such as Brexit voters, some of the people in the flyover states in America, some of the Gilets jaunes people, the yellow vests in France, who feel left behind, who feel nostalgic for the past, who feel overwhelmed, interested in a populist revolutionary, and also afraid or have a fear of the future. On the other side over here, perhaps some of the people on this call, you've got this sort of values of hedonism and being positive about technophilia. They like technology, they're early adopters, and probably believe that capitalism and medicine sort of broadly work despite their weaknesses. Down here, we have a cluster of values more closed and conservative around traditionalism, whether that's in terms of traditional gender roles, men know their place, women have their place, a traditional nationalism, my country right or wrong. Interesting that close to those people are people who are tired of environmentalism, saying it's all a con, and yet they're also into materialism and achievement. And they're a long way from over here, often the values of young and some younger people, beyond binary. This group, this value, is all about being very strongly committed to gender equality, but also to trans rights, to LGBT rights, and also believing that maybe there are only two sexes, but there are a lot more than two genders. And that's closest, if anything, to people who are very concerned about climate emergency. In the middle of the chart is the more mainstream stuff around individualism, conscious eating, discerning consumption. And we call this sort of grouping here conscious consumption. But it's interesting to see how global values map out. And the further apart things are, the less likely people are to share the two values. It doesn't mean to say that there won't be a trans activist who doesn't believe in environmentalism, but it's less and less likely. So those are the 36 global values, and they're grouped together into 12 trends. Now, I'm not going to go through all of this in detail. If you want another webinar on any of these trends, do let us know. But you can see that when we were trying to make sense of this for reporting, to produce a 100-page report, which you can download free of charge on your website, on our website. I'll give you the link at the end. You can see that, first of all, we've got climate antagonism, which, of course, environmentalism plus the reaction against it. Conscious health, I think it does what it says on the tin. A key one for many brands, authenticity is king. Oops. Sorry. The sense of provenance, brand purpose, discerning consumption, all grouped together. There's two around data and the tech dimension, and we have both rising apathy and in some ways anxiety, and I want to talk about that more later. We've got peak globalization. Again, it does what it says on the tin. We have a divided world, the battles between things like beyond binary, civil rights, and so on. We have capitalism's turning point. So even before COVID-19, capitalism turning point, that was really one of the key values that people were sharing around the world. And it's something that we obviously need to keep an eye on, especially with the current civil rights and the people who are feeling disenfranchised at the moment. Which leads us on to reactions to uncertainty and inequality, which we're seeing playing out in front of us at the moment. And this whole issue around fear of the future, which I'll come on to later in the presentation. Coupled with this, I guess, is the enduring appeal of nostalgia. So people who are, doing okay at the moment, it's the people, they're looking forward to the future, but people who maybe not doing so well, feeling left behind, definitely the sense of nostalgia is appealing to them. And a really important one is the search for simplicity and meaning, which we'll look at in a bit more detail. And lastly, choices over healthcare, conscientious health, and thinking about the choices that we're making is going to be massive. I think the COVID-19 is going to make people reappraise the situation that they're in and how they treat their health going forwards, and the demands and needs that they're going to have of their health service. I think the key thing when we're looking at trends, the key thing is that even with a shock like COVID-19 and a dramatic change in all of our lifestyles, it often takes much longer to shift underlying trends and macro forces before we arrive at possibly a new normal. And if this is going to be what I see as an L-shaped recovery rather than a V-shaped recovery, we will all be in a transition period for some time. So I'd now like to pass over to my colleague Dave Elliott, who's going to really look more about the here and now and looking at the tracking research that we've got from COVID-19 and how that's impacting Australia and New Zealand.
Thanks, Liz. Yes, what I want to do is just really give a quick snapshot of some of the key findings from our global COVID tracker. Ipsos began tracking global citizens' attitudes, behaviours and perceptions regarding the COVID pandemic, if you like, in mid-February, and we continue to track that weekly. So there's a lot of data, and obviously it moves around quite a bit in terms of where different countries are at different stages of the pandemic. To avoid jumping around, I guess what we've done is really try and concentrate our data on in around late April and early May. So first of all, if we look at what kinds of things people have been doing during lockdown, I think one of the things that really stands out for me is this high proportion of people who are using video to communicate with family and friends. I'm sure that's everyone on the call, that's been their experience as well. And we have other data from early on in our tracking, which actually showed that a lot of people thought this was going to be one of the real positives of this pandemic, is that it was actually going to bring us closer to family and friends. I think some of the other key points here are that almost 4 in 10 have tried a new brand or product because of an availability issue with their regular brand. And then we're seeing lots of sort of online and smartphone purchasing in terms of purchasing from stores, ordering food delivery, and even downloading games on our smartphones. We also then spoke to people about, well, that's what you're doing now, thinking about in 6 months' time, what do you think you're going to be doing? And I guess what we saw is that a lot of these behaviours, people are predicting they will continue to use. So I think the key ones that we're seeing come through there are continuation of using banking apps or mobile sites, using video to communicate with family and friends, using video streaming services, and again, a continuation of that smartphone gameplay. So what is normal going to look like? I think what we see is overwhelmingly for New Zealanders and Australians, there's a desire for a return to normalcy. So you can see here that for Australia, it's 53% were saying that they're predicting they'll be making small changes, but really mostly will be behaving in the same manner as they always have. That's slightly higher in New Zealand at 54%. But then there's another 26% in Australia who are saying their intention is that they will do everything exactly the same as they did before the pandemic. and that's slightly lower in New Zealand, around at 19%. But we do see some signals of things that will change. So clearly, and I guess unsurprisingly, a large proportion of both Australians and Kiwis are predicting that they will continue to avoid large crowds and events. Surprisingly, I think only around half are suggesting they'd get the vaccine for COVID-19 as soon as it's available. Flu shots at a slightly lower level, and perhaps more concerning are the issues around travel and public transport. So you can see around 4 in 10 in Australia and New Zealand are saying they intend to travel less. And then slightly lower, but similar levels at 38% and 32% saying they're going to avoid public transport. One of the really interesting things we've been seeing since middle of April and certainly throughout May is this real tension between a desire for normal and a return to sort of getting back to our daily lives, but a real anxiety about that return to normal. So here you can see in that top half, you'll see there's Australia on the left, New Zealand at the right, but you can see just around a third, getting close to 40%, talking about that they really want to see the economy restarted and want businesses open. But then what sits beside that is 6 in 10 in both Australia and New Zealand also reporting that when that happens, they're going to feel very nervous about leaving their homes. And interesting, we released some other data last week that showed Australians at least completely split on around 50% were saying opening businesses is going to put too many people at risks, where we had a similar proportion saying, no, it was time to open business, the risk was minimal, and we really need to restart the economy. So then thinking about, do we think the economy is going to recover quickly? I guess the very quick answer is no. You can see here we've asked people whether they agree the economy will recover quickly once the lockdown is over, and only around a third of Australians, for most of the time we've been tracking, have said that they agree with that, and exactly the same or similar proportion in New Zealand. So then what does come clear is that this view of return to normality looks like it's quite a distant off. So you can see here what we're doing is comparing the global average with Australia and New Zealand. And I guess the first thing that becomes quite obvious is Australia's pretty much on track with the global average, but there is some slight differences when we look at the New Zealand population. So around a third or 3 in 10 are talking about, look, it's going to take 6 months to a year to return to normal, but then for both Australia and New Zealand, you're then looking at a further quarter saying, no, we think that's 1 to 2 years. And then where you see some divergence, you see only around 8% of Australians saying 2 years or longer, 1% saying never, versus with New Zealand, it's 2 in 10 are still saying this is going to be 2 years or longer, but a similar proportion at never. I guess one of the big questions then, well, can we spend our way out of the recessions if that's what we think is going to happen? Again, I think the fairly short answer is probably not, or if we can, it's going to be quite difficult. So you can see both Australia and New Zealand here, when we look at early May, late April, around 7 in 10 were agreeing that the pandemic will have a financial impact on them and their family. And we're seeing that impact come through in the way people manage their finances. So again, I think it's interesting here that New Zealand and Australia are very, very similar here, but we talk to people about what are they kind of doing differently with their finances. And you can see 27% for both Australia and New Zealand saying they're delaying or cancelling big purchases. 19 and 16 respectively have applied for or are going to get government assistance. Similar proportions, again, using savings to pay their bills, and even 1 in 10 having to actually postpone paying at least one bill. So it is already impacting them. What we've got here is just a couple of quick charts showing the Refinitiv Ipsos Primary Consumer Sentiment Index. So I guess it's a measure that we've had going for quite some time that takes in a variety of measures and brings them into an index. So it looks at current and future perceptions of the country's economy, current and future perceptions of the local economy, but then also looks at people's future outlook in terms of their own finances and how they're thinking and feeling about some key purchases. And so what you can see here is that we've come out of a period of pretty a high level of optimism around our our economy and our future. And that's really plummeted in 2020 with COVID coming through. But we're similar to a lot of other countries. So you can see here in Great Britain, a similar kind of pattern. It's that very quick plunge. And in Great Britain, they're actually saying that that's the worst it's looked for 20 years, and they're predicting it to get worse. And then here we thought it might be reasonable to look at Germany, a similar comparator given the situation there. But again, you can see that same pattern of positivity and a real quick plunge as we hit 2020. We've also, one of the things we've been tracking throughout the COVID tracker is looking at perceptions of how people feel about the government and its performance. So I think you can see here for both New Zealand and Australia, it's climbed over time. So, and then the other aspect is, by and large, people are very happy with the government's performance. So you can see in Australia, it's sitting at 81% in early May, and that's been pretty consistent throughout May and into early June. It's sitting around that 81% level. And New Zealand, probably not surprising, also very positive, but more positive. And I think the love affair with the government over there continues, and you can see they're now sitting at sort of around that 93%. And the other, I guess, lastly thing I'll finish up with is that during April, when the government started talking about the COVID Safe app and introducing it and wanting people to really take it on board, we quickly put a couple of questions into the global tracker just to have a look at sort of the proportions of people that would download it. So you can see here in the first week we put it in late April, we had 45% of smartphone users in Australia saying they were likely to download the app. And then within 1 week later, that had actually increased 7 points up to 52%. And what we saw there is for those who weren't prepared to do it, it was really about privacy concerns. And I guess similar findings in New Zealand, but again, back to that love affair with the government, we did see slightly higher intention to uptake the app in New Zealand. Thanks, Liz. I'll hand back to you.
Thanks, Dave. That's great. It's great, really good to see the local picture on how things are going. My next little section before I hand over to Jules. There's really, currently at this stage of the impact of COVID-19, there are 4 trends that I really want to highlight. The first of these are the reactions to inequality and uncertainty. One thing that is clear is that even before COVID-19, one of the strongest values shared by people globally was this fear of the future. What I've done here is just rank all the values generated from those hundreds and hundreds of questions in the Global Trend Survey. And you can see you have climate emergency at the top, but also faith in medicine. You've got fear of the future along with data apathy, and that actually was similarly matched to data anxiety. You've got discerning consumption and wealth redistribution. Unfortunately, faith in capitalism and tired of environmentalism is a bit further down the chart. So you can see the things that really tend to unite the planet. And one of them is this anxiety about the future. And in particular, one of the groups that are most affected is the millennials group. I mean, if you can think about it, that basically they kind of came of age just after 2000. They were just kind of getting going after the GFC, you know, starting to have families, get married and so on. And now this hits them. So this is going to be very interesting to see the pressure on financial situation and how that's going to play out from a generational perspective. Some of you might be familiar with our generational research that we do, so we will be tracking this and we will be able to have a look at this maybe over the next year or so. The enduring appeal of nostalgia is also very important. We've got this trend here, which, you know, was already there before COVID-19, but now you've got 50% of the planet wanting their country to be the way it used to be, with the least likely country to say that being China. Why? I guess because China, people can of course remember and will have relatives who will have stories of family and grandparents actually starving to death in the 50s and 60s. In the West, of course, it's a very different thing. It doesn't mean we want to go back to the past and make things like homosexuality illegal again, but it does mean that there is a longing for good and easy things from the past. And we're definitely seeing some signs of renewed nostalgia now. Another key trend that kind of goes with nostalgia is the search for simplicity and meaning. How do we make things simple, and how do we give people meaning? And again, you know, will we see a massive reappraisal of people's lives and consumption? Consumers are currently spending about 25% less on average than they did before the crisis. You know, all of those oat milk lattes and the smashed avocado, they're gone. Did it make you happier buying clothes every week? Did it make you happier? Perhaps people will reappraise going forward. And even before COVID-19, 60% in Australia and 63% worldwide were wanting their life to be simpler. And interestingly, so at the same time, of course, you've got that search for simplicity. You've also got, you know, if the future is threatening, then hedonism. This is the global trend between 2013 and 2020 on hedonism. The important thing is to enjoy life today, and tomorrow will take care of itself. It's gone from 50 to 58% in 6 years. With the young, who were wondering what on earth is going to happen even before COVID-19, that was even stronger. And another key trend is authenticity is king. People saying that they want to buy from brands that share their values. And brands are standing out still as a key identifier, particularly in the developing world, slightly less so in, say, Western Europe and America. So how can we use that framework of those 36 values and those 12 trends to anticipate changes that we could permanently see from COVID-19? I'm going to hand over now to Jules Hall, CEO of The Whole Way, for his thoughts on how this can be used and the research can be used for context for forward planning. Thanks, Jules.
Thanks, Liz. So Ipsos have asked me to share my thoughts on what this survey means for marketers and marketing. And having spent time reading the survey, I can testify to the volume of information and insight that it provides. But to bring this back to some key outtakes, I've anchored my observations to 3 of the key themes that are topical in the world of marketing right now. And they are marketing effectiveness, brand purpose, and data and privacy. So the first one, marketing effectiveness. And across so many of the trends, and now supercharged by the COVID-related economic decline, there is immense uncertainty across the board. Now, the world is in a period of change, and that was happening pre-COVID. It's only been amplified. Change is unsettling. It makes it hard to predict the future, which one could argue, of course, is a permanent reality. But the fact remains that we humans feel more comfortable when we have a view of what we should be expecting. And business is one area of society where certainty is highly desired. And a direct implication of the pursuit of certainty in businesses will be increasing pressure on marketing to provide certainty around future performance projections. And what this is going to do, in my opinion, is put a rocket under the marketing effectiveness movement, which is really exciting. The research findings of the past decade, really starting in 2010 with the publishing of Byron Sharp's book, How Brands Grow, through the work done by Burnett and Field in the UK, to the works of Karen Nelson Field and Mark Ritson, and of course, organizations like Ipsos have given us the empirical evidence to really understand what works in marketing and, importantly, why it works. But to use those principles effectively, it's really important to be acutely aware of the societal context. If the marketing effectiveness principles are the engine that delivers results, the language and tonality of our communication is the oil that lubricates that machine to make sure it runs smoothly. And we need to make sure that the language and tonality we're using in our communications is aligned to the realities of the consumers that we're talking to. Now, we've experienced this at the Whole Way very dramatically and very recently, working on the launch of Binge. And the insight that underpinned the brand was the pleasure of taking time to indulge yourself in your favorite shows, basically sticking two fingers up at the societal pressures to be out there doing things and constantly achieving. And then all of a sudden, everyone was forced to be at home, and we weren't actually allowed to do the stuff that we were rebelling against. And very rapidly, with the launch of that brand approaching, we had to re-architect the entire communications platform to ensure that it was tonally appropriate to the current context. Now, importantly, the core brand essence didn't change, but the way we told that story did evolve. And this brings me on to my second theme of brand purpose. And this has been a hotly debated topic the past couple of years, with some high-profile examples of brands taking positions that they can't or couldn't genuinely live up to. And that has created pushback, and there are a number of commentators declaring brand purpose as a redundant tool. Personally, I don't agree with that. A correctly architected purpose gives a brand and a business a really clear North Star. Knowing your why galvanizes your team, your internal team, firstly and most importantly. It informs your product innovation and it anchors your communications. Now, of course, all of that depends on authenticity. And as Ipsos have identified, now more than ever, authenticity is king. And nowhere is that more important than brand purpose. Where this gets interesting for businesses and where some grown-up calls need to be made is around some of the macro forces that Liz talked about right at the beginning, particularly to my mind, the fragility of our planet, data world, and technology tipping points. It's really important that businesses, brands, and marketers really understand these things. And of course, where we can take action to make a positive impact, we absolutely should. But at the very same time, brands should not be hitching their wagon to causes that they can't genuinely influence. Today's consumers are simply too well informed. And again, as the research highlights, you have a chance to read it, particularly amongst the younger generations, consumers are fact-checking brands and they're calling them out where their behaviors don't align with their claims. The third point, data and privacy. One of the most interesting slides for me in the deck that Liz took us through was the shared values slide, and data apathy and data anxiety feature at number 7 and number 9 respectively on the list. And the actual survey report goes into more detail, but to trace the situation, most people are concerned about how businesses and governments use data. But at the same time, it's not really influencing the actual behaviors. So in other words, we say one thing and do something else. But we do need to be aware this could change. And just as we've rapidly moved from climate concerns to climate emergency, the same flip could happen with data and privacy, with a sudden shift in consumer permissions around data capture and usage. And the GDPR, and more recently the CCPA in the US, will certainly be amplifying the potential of that to happen. Now, if that does happen, something quite interesting could occur, which is a brand's privacy and data policy starts to become a point of distinction. And it may even become a default requirement of product consideration. Now, at that point, like price today, privacy and data would start to become a default nudge to purchase propensity. If that is to become the case, it would really pay to understand this nudge now and to think about how it influences communications and user experiences that brands are creating. So in summary of the 3 points, marketing effectiveness, brand purpose, data and privacy, really it comes back to this. Context is king. And as we all know, the most effective marketing applies proven techniques in contextually relevant ways. And the Ipsos survey is a really good tool for understanding where the world is at, and just as importantly, understanding what is changing, but also what isn't changing. And that's a really interesting outtake for me. So on that point, I will hand back to Liz, who will appear on screen any moment.
that was really interesting. It's really good to hear how the research can be applied into real marketing, you know, tasks and briefs that are being sent around at the moment. So basically, we come back to this point where we started, that predictions are hard. Often people are wrong, but at least we have the right sort of evidence to help us. We also know that big data is out there, it's watching us, and so many things on my screen now. But what we're saying here is that the most adaptable brands, as Darwin said, the most adaptable brands and countries will thrive, and not necessarily the biggest. It won't necessarily be the biggest that survive. And the challenges we face, in conclusion, we still have things like climate emergency. That's not gone away. So do we refocus on that together? We've got no agreement globally on response, but it's the one value in our survey that unites the world in terms of what people agree on. We have data anxiety and worry that the technologies are destroying our lives, typically among the young, but we also have plenty signs of rising data apathy. And we've got this very strong a sense of loss of the future that was present even before COVID-19. So do we see a tipping point in creating a new one, or just sitting back and watching what happens? Will that mean more challenges to elites? There are certainly some scenarios that could see more political instability as a result of a long-term squeeze on incomes. We've got people now reappraising the importance of local shopping, not global supply chains. And will we see supply chains shorten and contract? Does that mean reshoring in a big way? How does that look? We have that search for simplicity in health, which we can see, if anything, being strengthened by the lockdown and the aftermath of that. But we also have escapism and rising hedonism. So which one wins? Or can we have both? You have simplicity in health Monday to Friday, and then hedonism Friday and Saturday. We have that general search for authenticity, but of course, the challenge for most brands and the authenticity on the part of politicians is, of course, ongoing skepticism. So those are some of the ongoing conundrums that we have. Really, we've kind of touched the, the tip of the iceberg, literally the very tip of the iceberg, and taking you through the local trends in COVID-19. And if you're interested, do have a look at the website, ipsosglobaltrends.com, or email me at WITF@ipsos.com. We can actually, there is, I'll just wrap up a little bit here, that we can arrange behind the paywall, of course, a virtual presentation or workshop that will give you access to the portal and a lot more information. You can cut all 370 questions. You can compare people from all over the world, and you can see how their views compare on all these 370 issues. It's all there. Now, we do have a little bit of time just at the end for questions. We've got a few coming through, basic, sort of the theme being around the simplicity and meaning. We'll just go to look at one. So yeah, one interesting question we've got here is to ask Dave and Jules to expand on their thoughts around examples that they're noticing, signals in the market around the simplicity and meaning trend. So Dave.
Thanks, Liz. Yeah, look, I think the simplicity and the authenticity trend are wrapped up and together, and they are relevant for both the corporate world and for government. Taking first a look at the corporate world, really that's about brands and solutions that can make life simple. They're really going to resonate with the community. I think it means that communications really have to cut through, as they've always have, but we need to make sure that the audience doesn't have to work too hard to understand what it is we're trying to say to them and how we're trying to connect with them. And then obviously from a brand point of view, we need to stay true to the brand and its values. I think for government, you then almost sort of bring in this nostalgia piece as well, because it is quite a strong play there. And I think for government, it's about telling a really compelling story if you're going to actually challenge those beliefs that things are worse off now. Then obviously we have to then take into the context of, you know, as Jules mentioned, context is really important. We have to take in the context that in this COVID-dominated world, there's a need for reassurance. So consumers and citizens want to hear from retailers, want to hear from businesses, and want to hear from government what it is that they're doing, and reassure us that they know what they're doing, they know how to keep us safe, and that they know it's important to get the economy moving, but they're going to limit the risk to both shoppers and to the community at large.
Thanks, Dave. That's great. Jules, have you got a perspective on maybe brands and maybe what does that mean in terms of brand positioning?
Yeah, I do. Like, just building on what Dave was saying, this really sort of comes back to storytelling and how do we make stories meaningful? It's make sure they're relevant to people. And this is really interesting in the context of brands, because you've got static elements that change infrequently, and you've got more dynamic elements. And the core brand essence the brand architecture doesn't change and shouldn't be rapidly changing to circumstances. But the way we tell the story of the brand does need to be more dynamic. I touched on the example of Binge and the challenge of being about to go into production on the launch campaign for that as the lockdown arrived. Another interesting example was KFC, who had were using the line "finger licking good," which pre-COVID was a really good thing. The minute COVID landed, it was a really bad thing for brands to be encouraging, and they had to pivot very quickly. Now, the core brand architecture that sat behind that didn't change, but the way they told their brand story did need to change. And they had to make sure they were telling a story that was relevant to the context and therefore meaningful to the people they wanted to connect to.
Yeah, that's a really good example, actually. Thank you. I think we're probably going to wrap it up there. So thank you, Jules and Dave, for being on the webinar and being part of the panel this morning. Just as a reminder to everyone, the website is free to air with the report. It's a 120-page report, I think, which you can download for free. You can dig into the COVID-19 tabs and look at all the different aspects of what we're noticing, how it's impacting our lives. Look for some of the signals that we're mapping out on the website. There's things like Heinz opening its direct shop. We've got things like Chinese traditional medicine treatment for COVID-19 users, using bear bile, which may come from the sort of wet market where the whole disease came from in the first place, which is quite ironic. There's McDonald's redesigning its logo in Brazil. There's lots of things in there about Australia and New Zealand, especially around travel. So we've mapped out dozens of these signals for you. I think there's over 100 on there at the moment, which you can go on and have a look at with all the links attached as well, and see which ones might apply to you. Just in terms of the next webinar, so this webinar has really been mostly focusing on the global trend survey and the macro and the big picture, but obviously with a bit of local flavor. But the next one that we're going to look at is bringing together more of these signals, navigating the opportunities and pitfalls for Australia and New Zealand post-COVID-19. We're planning to do that in July. And we're going to build in some of the other qualitative research that we've been doing at a local level as well. So thank you, everybody. Thank you for sticking with us, despite some of the technical hitches. I do hope you found that useful. There's lots more on the website. Do check it out. Do let us know what you think. We will run more webinars on different aspects of this over the year. The data is very rich. The content is all there. We can dig into it in a number of different ways. So we look forward to sharing more with you in the future. And if we do want to know what you think, so please send me your feedback as well. So thank you.
Thanks, Liz.
Thank you. Thanks, Jules. Thanks, Dave. Thanks, everyone.